it's a very warm welcome, everyone, to our hybrid seminar, Giving Substance to Obligations for Third States and International Organizations, arising from the ICJ Advisory Opinion on the legality of Israel's military occupation in the Palestinian Territories. Our speaker for today is Miss Lisa Wiese from Leipzig University in Germany. She is a visiting researcher at the African Center for Transnational Criminal Justice. Thank you very much, Lisa, for taking your time to present the seminar. Once again, I would like to welcome everyone who has taken their time to join this very important conversation on such a topical issue. Without further ado, I will hand over to Prof. John McEe, our director at the ICJ, to give the welcome and opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mushariwa, and a good afternoon to you all. Wherever you're joining us from, we're gathered here at the African Center for Transnational Criminal Justice, Faculty of Law, University of the Western Cape. And we're very delighted to welcome our visiting researcher, Ms. Lisa Wiese. Today, she's going to be presenting a paper on giving substance to obligations for third states and international organizations arising from the ICJ Advisory Opinion on the legality of Israel's military occupation in the Palestinian Territories. As we all may be aware, the situation in Palestine is very, very serious at the moment. But for lawyers and academics, we try to put all of this in proper context, especially the legal implications. As an institution based in South Africa, we follow these developments very keenly on the backdrop of South Africa's application to the ICJ for provisional measures on the Israeli-Palestine conflict. As you all know, and the ICJ issued two decisions on provisional measures regarding the situation in Palestine. But prior to that, in 2022, you also may be aware that the UN General Assembly adopted the resolution in which it referred the matter to the ICJ to render an advisory opinion on the policies and practices of Israel in Palestine and the occupied territories in Palestine, including East Jerusalem. So it is to look at the legal implications of all of these developments that we are gathered here today, and we're very glad that Ms. Wiese will be talking to us about the obligations for third states like South Africa and like the United Nations as an international organization, so we can make sense of all of these developments. So I would not want to dwell much on this. I will now hand over the floor to our researcher to give us her presentation. Thank you.
Well, yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity for me to be here, for hosting me, and for the opportunity to discuss with you and your students about the third state obligations deriving from the ICJ Advisory Opinion. For me, it really is a privilege to be here in South Africa, a country that has taken a leading role on the international stage for ending illegal occupation and apartheid in Israel and Palestine. So I want to start with a question, and I want you to imagine a world in which Palestinians and Israelis live together side by side peacefully. And what would be the first steps for this to happen? Imagine the first steps for this to happen, piece by piece, side by side, in Israel and Palestine. And in my opinion, I think the first step would be to name the state wrong and the illegality of the state conduct. And that is exactly what the ICJ now did with his groundbreaking advisory opinion on the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem. So for those of you who are not one slide back, no, it's okay. Perfect.
Yeah, I was gonna ask
Yes.
if you can let me know when you have.
Yes, I definitely will. So for those of you who are not familiar with the ICJ advisory opinion yet, I want to give a very, very short outline of this. The ICJ found that Israel's continued occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories violates various rules of international law, and that Israel actually has to withdraw from the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible. It also found that Israel violates Article 3, CERT, which is the norm for apartheid and segregation. And even though it hasn't specifically determined whether the wrong of segregation or the wrong of apartheid was committed, it still found a violation of Article 3. But there are many different other findings of the court, including with regard to the obligations of third states like South Africa or like Germany. What are third states supposed to do in this matter? And you can already see that the opinion covers many different legal issues, and some of them are quite novel. And we can easily say that this is one of the most important decisions that the ICJ has delivered so far. So you can go to the next slide. The one before. Yes, thank you. So before we dive into the specifics of the third state of obligations, I want to give you a short introduction on the nature and the effects of ICJ advisory opinions in general. And then I will explain where the third state obligations dogmatically derive from and explain the two concepts, obligations erga omnes and norms of jus cogens. The third state obligation will then focus on the duty to cooperate, the duty of non-recognition, and the duty not to render aid or assistance. And finally, I will briefly draw attention to the possible implications the advisory opinion might have on individual criminal responsibility, which might be the most interesting part for you here. So my goal is to unpack the advisory opinion regarding the obligations for Germany or for South Africa as third states as much as possible, and then we will continue with hopefully a discussion here in the group. Okay, next slide, please. So although the advisory opinion is a judicial decision, it has no immediate legal effects on any other state or international organizations. According to Article 59 of the ICJ Statute, only decisions in contentious proceedings have binding force, which in turn is limited to the parties involved in the particular case. But nevertheless, an advisory opinion does have indirect effects on the subjects of international law by setting a precedent. Therefore, an advisory opinion is indirectly binding regarding its legal findings, as the ICJ will rely on its settled jurisprudence in any further judicial decisions. The advisory opinion also lays out the content of already existing treaty obligations that states have entered into, and depending on the norms violated, specific treaty mechanisms can be triggered to enforce or to at least enhance the compliance by states. Next slide. So the ICJ has observed that the obligations violated by Israel, including certain obligations erga omnes and inferred legal consequences for third states. The terminology that the court has used raised serious questions regarding the role of the finding of erga omnes obligations breached by Israel and the nexus on further third state obligations. they are two separate concepts, the concepts of obligations erga omnes and norms of jus cogens, and they need more clarification regarding their interplay, function, and scope, which the court did not deliver in his advisory opinion. And this has been criticized by the ICJ judges in their separate opinions and by scholars because it remains unclear where exactly the obligations for third states derive from, since the court argued with a violation of obligations erga omnes, while applying terminology for aggravated state responsibility for the breach of jus cogens, which is laid out in Article 41 of the ILC draft articles for state responsibility. And therefore, it seemed like it conflated those two concepts. And although they are very similar in nature and function, they are not symmetrical. The violation of obligations erga omnes partes produces effects at the procedural level, which has been used by South Africa in his preliminary proceedings at the ICJ. And it can give standing before the ICJ for not directly injured states in response to a breach of obligations erga omnes partes, but it does not automatically create further obligations for third states. Whereas the function of jus cogens, this can trigger third state responsibility. And if you apply jus cogens norm, then the violation has to be assessed very carefully, applying Article 41 of the ILC draft articles. Next slide. Exactly. Yes. Here you can read what Article 41 says. It states that the legal consequences for third states, it refers to Article 40, which defines the prerequisites for the application of Article 41. So the obligations arise by a serious violation of a peremptory norm of general international law. And such a violation is serious if it involves a very gross and systematic failure, so it entails a threshold of magnitude, which actually has been crossed by Israel in the ICJ advisory opinion findings, and therefore triggered third state obligations. Next slide. One of the first one that the ICJ called out is, it called out on the states to cooperate within the United Nations. And although cooperation lies at the heart of the whole international legal order, there is no general international legal obligation to cooperate. It is just not part of existing international law. So the obligation can only exist in a specific duty related to a certain aspect deriving from the law of state responsibility. But what exactly does the obligation to cooperate entail now for the states? And while explaining this, I rely on the work by my colleague Adrian Schildheuer, who is actually, he researches a lot to the law of international organizations. And he explained to me that the first thing that is very important is to understand that the primary responsibility for regulating the modalities required to ensure the end of Israel's illegal presence in the OPT and the full realization of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, it rests with the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council. But the member states of the UN have a corresponding duty to cooperate with the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council. They comprise of member states' representatives, so the duty to cooperate also entails an indirect duty on states as members of these organs to work towards resolving the conflict. And as political organs, they are generally free in their decision-making. However, the ICJ advisory opinion imposes limitations on the discretion of the Security Council. The members of the organs must use their discretion in a reasonable manner and in good faith. And the UN organs' options now range from condemnation of Israel's actions to recommendation up to Chapter 7 measures, including non-military and military sanctions. And I don't know if you follow the news regarding this, but in September, most recently, like 1 or 2 weeks ago, the UN General Assembly actually delivered on this obligation, and it called for specific measures against the Israeli occupation. You can go on the next slide now. The UN General Assembly voted with a large majority to end Israel's illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories without delay. It calls for Israel to comply with international law and withdraw its military forces immediately and cease all settlement activities, evacuate all settlers from the OPT, and dismantle parts of the separation wall it constructed inside of the occupied Palestinian territories. And also the General Assembly resolution called on the third states to cease importing products originated from Israeli settlements and to halt the transfer of arms, munitions, and related equipment to Israel. The resolution also urges states to implement sanctions such as travel bans, asset freezes, and against individuals, entities involved in maintaining Israel's unlawful presence in Palestine. And this includes addressing issues related to settler violence and ensuring that those engaged in these activities face legal and financial consequences. And now if you look at this chart, can you see how Germany has voted on this UN resolution? Who does? Yes. Why did Germany abstain from this resolution? Any assumptions? Do you have an idea? Okay, for this, I will explain to you 2 German terms now. The one, maybe you've heard of them. The one is Fremdschämen. This is actually a term that does not really exist in another language, but it means to feel embarrassed for a decision or like for what someone else did. And this is actually, to be honest, how I feel regarding the vote by my government. But the other term I want to explain to you is the term Staatsräson, which in French it's raison d'état, or you can also explain it with matter of state. And yeah, the Staatsräson, it actually explains very well the behavior by Germany that it voted with abstention in this resolution. It is a public claim that leads beyond solidarity. It means unwavering support for Israel, and it is a public claim, that has been repeated ever since, even, especially after the October 7th attack. And for Germany, the security of Israel is not negotiable, and it also shares Israel's military goals. And as we see now, Germany is confronted with international law violations by Israel, and still, even after all that's been documented and laid out about what is happening in Gaza right now, it is still trying to balance the Staatsräson, but also comply with international law, and it gets more and more difficult now. It is questionable whether Germany can continue to adhere to the raison d'état, the Staatsräson, without simultaneously violating its own obligations under international law. And according to the advisory opinion, there are now 2 further obligations that I would like to address. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, the next one is the obligation of non-recognition. States are obliged not to recognize the situation in the West Bank as lawful. And this duty actually entails even implied recognition in any form, and it goes beyond the formal declaration of non-recognition. It is actually a duty of isolation. So states are obliged to refrain from any relations, diplomatic or consular, with Israel implying recognition of the Israeli authority in the occupied Palestinian territory. So the states are obliged to deny the legal validity of all purported public acts of the Israeli military, civil, or judicial administration in the occupied Palestinian territories. And the obligation of non-recognition also entails a duty to distinguish between Israeli and Palestinian territory and not to enter into treaty relations with Israel in cases in which it purports to act on behalf of the Palestinian people. And what do you think? What about the question of Palestinian statehood? Does this obligation maybe even imply to recognize a state of Palestine? What do you think? Do you know what the German stance is on that? Does Germany recognize the state of Palestine? What do you think?
With German policies on Israel, I would be surprised if you feel.
Yes, no, for decades, no. They do not recognize the state of Palestine. So in the German scholarship, they have wondered if maybe the obligation of non-recognition and the obligation to distinguish, if it does on the other side entail an obligation to recognize the state of Israel, but it does not, it definitely does not. There is no international legal obligation for a state to recognize another state or to recognize the Palestinian Authority as a legitimate Palestinian government. So there are countries in Europe like, I forgot which one they were. I think it was Spain and Sweden. Maybe you can Google it. I just forgot. There were just 3 European countries that most recently recognized Palestine as a state. And it was, it caused lots of trouble within the European Union because the European Union is very divided on this stance right now. So there are some countries like, for example, Netherlands or Italy and Spain who stopped exporting weapons to Israel, but many other countries, France, Germany, Great Britain or England, they actually still export weapons and are still in strong support for Israel. So yeah, to close this chapter, there is no obligation to recognize Palestine as a state, and it's completely up to the state's view whether or not they recognize a government as legitimate or not. Okay, next slide. Yeah, the next one is the obligation not to render aid or assistance, and this is probably the most difficult one to grasp because it's a question: when does a state render aid or assistance to an internationally wrongful act? To what extent does state conduct really contribute to the maintenance of a breach of a jus cogens norm? And I want to give you some examples why this is so difficult to determine. After Russia attacked Ukraine, India, for example, still purchased oil from Russia, and it was called out by the USA for this conduct because it would support Russia's war against Ukraine. And Germany completely stopped buying Russian oil. We are completely dependent on Russian oil. Before the attack on Ukraine, all our oil came from Russia. And then the government said, no, we don't want to support this act of violence. And then they stopped buying Russian oil, which led to an energy crisis and inflation in Germany. And the German government argued, well, we don't want to support this attack. And on the other hand, Germany bought the oil from India, and India bought the oil from Russia. And we paid a higher price for it, obviously. So it is really difficult to determine what acts actually do render aid and give assistance to a breach of a jus cogens norm. And another example is Turkey wouldn't close its airspace for Russian planes. And Israel, on the other hand, has recently blocked Ukraine from buying the Pegasus spyware, undermining Ukraine's ability to defend itself. So with these examples, what do you think? How could we provide or give a yardstick for states to know when they are helping or giving assistance to a breach of jus cogens and when not. Like, this is really important for states to determine. And it is very difficult because, the state conduct worldwide is very, very different. So it triggers lots of discussion. And even when governments defend their behavior, or maybe even their support for Israel now, or the exportation of weapons, it is very difficult to determine whether or not they violate their obligation not to render aid or assistance. So the state practice is very insufficient, and as I said, there is not really a yardstick for determining the aid provided and whether or not it is significant for the maintenance of the unlawful situation. So for anyone who is still looking for a research topic, I think this would be it. And maybe you're already familiar with the case that was filed by Nicaragua against Germany. Germany has been accused by Nicaragua for rendering aid and even being complicit in the breach of a jus cogens norm, namely genocide and breaches of international humanitarian law. And even though Germany is the second largest supporter of weapons to Israel, the ICJ has not declared a violation of international law by Germany, mainly because Germany has a very intact and sufficient national arms control procedure. So they said their own procedure is sufficient enough. And if the German government controls the export of weapons, then the ICJ found that it's fine. And we will see how the ICJ will decide in its main proceedings, because it was just the preliminary proceedings. But hopefully the ICJ will determine some criteria when a state risks to violate its obligations not to render aid. And I think this will be the case to look at how this will be determined and decided. Okay, next slide. Yes, last but not least, I want to explain some potential implications the advisory opinion might have for individual criminal responsibility. And even though the advisory opinion was not connected to Israel's conduct in Gaza, and its responses to the attack on October 2023, the findings of the advisory opinion provide a reasonable basis to believe that crimes against humanity and war crimes have been perpetrated by the state of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territories against the Palestinian population. And as a result, there arise several direct and indirect consequences with respect to individual criminal responsibility. And states have to move beyond the diplomatic condemnation and now are obliged to prosecute and punish those responsible for serious violations of international law. They are supposed to open structural proceedings and investigations to prosecute Israeli state or military officials for these violations under universal jurisdiction. And this is one of the essential responsibilities third states have now. And the other one is very tied to the obligation not to render aid and not to become complicit in war crimes or crimes against humanity. And with the findings of the ICJ, third states and other private entities, they have been made aware now of the illegality of the conduct of Israel in the OPT in no uncertain terms. And therefore, the ICJ kind of opened the possibility for both civil and criminal liability claims in many parts of the world. And I don't know how many cases you have in South Africa that are based on universal jurisdiction. We have 2 or 3 very popular ones in Germany regarding Syria and torture in Syria. And they have been successful, but they took a while, like 2 to 3 years. And it was not easy. So state officials or corporate executives, they could be held accountable now, knowingly aiding or providing direct and substantial assistance to the crimes in question. And such complicity may take the form of transferring weapons, other essential material support to Israel, contributing to war crimes and crimes against humanity. And finally, there is also an indirect consequence, the advisory opinion. It has laid the groundwork for broadening the scope of prosecution at the ICC. And although the violations before October 2023 are not part of the arrest warrants filed by the ICC prosecutor in May 2024, the ICC has jurisdiction and has long been requested to investigate these violations in the OPT since 2015, when Palestine actually ratified the ICC statute. And while the findings in the advisory opinion do not meet the evidentiary threshold required for a trial, they do lend weight to the pre-trial considerations and the need to prioritize the situation at the ICC now. So next slide. Yes. So now, having laid out some of the consequences for third states, you might think, probably especially the students, because in my experience, students get frustrated with international law because we present them, we tell them the norms and the obligations, and then they see politics happening and they say, well, it's not very effective, international law. And even if you see evidence for this stance, I don't want you, especially I'm talking to the students now, I don't want them to get too frustrated with international law or their enforcement mechanisms, because we really, especially in times like these right now, we need young people in the face of training and education who actually believe in a rules-based international order and people who defend it. And before I end this presentation, I want to show you a short video by Yuval Noah Harari. He is an Israeli historian and author, and he has been teaching and researching military history and universal history theories at the Hebrew University in Israel. And yeah, just listen to what he has to say. It's very short.
For Palestinians are at present immersed in pain, totally incapable of feeling or recognizing the pain of anyone else. But I do expect from people, outsiders, like people in Germany, don't be intellectually lazy, don't be emotionally lazy, don't see just part of this terrible reality to somehow keep a space for future peace, because we can't keep that space right now. But we know from history that after years, the pain heals somewhat. And you know, Germans and Israelis, or Germans and Jews, after what happened during the Holocaust, eventually they became friends. So if this is possible, then anything is possible. Israelis and also Palestine.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, well, my biggest takeaways from this video, and you've already mentioned it, we have to give context. And I really like how he said, don't be intellectually and emotionally lazy, because this conflict is really difficult to understand. It is always important to see both of these sides, and to hold space actually for both of these sides. And I also like that he's giving prosperity for healing and for peace. And I think South Africa has provided a great example for this process and how long and painful this process can be. I think transitional justice is like the field that needs lots of attention now, how we can go from regimes of injustice to justice. And yeah, that's so far what I had to say. You can go to the next slide. And I would like, to open up any questions you might have.
Thank you very much for such a thought-provoking presentation, Lisa. We will now move on to the next part of our program, which is the question and answer, as she has already said, and this will be facilitated by Dr. Munyai. Dr. Munyai.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mushoriwa. I hope I am audible. Are there any questions?
Yes, you are audible.
I have a question, actually. I would like to know what you think of the German Staatsräson. How is it perceived in other countries? Because maybe, I mean, the Staatsräson, it comes from the German history, obviously, like the genocide that was committed against the Jewish people. And now Israel is considered a safe place for Jewish people. So the German government made it its obligation, and it actually is on the same level as constitutional law, to say that we want to protect the state of Israel. So how can this protection look like? Do we support military, or do we say this is too far, this is not right, this is not legal? Like, it's really, it comes from an historic responsibility, but now for me, it looks like, again, we are standing on the wrong side of history. I know this is a big term, but it is, and it is a minority in Germany where it's perceived like this. And for me, even in scholarship, not like in research at the university, it is very difficult to speak out and to name the wrong that is being done by Israel. I feel like I have to be very cautious about what you say, because you immediately get the claim of being anti-Semitic, and people have been fired for just stating facts, basically. So it's a very delicate topic for me. I know I can speak more openly here, but just to make you sensitive for this, back home in Germany, I'd probably be a lot more careful about what I say.
Okay, you have a question.
Thank you very much for the presentations. We actually kind of like spoke to the question I wanted to ask. I have had the opportunity of interacting with one or two persons from Germany, and my question is, to what extent do Germany feel kind of, maybe, will I say, guilt for what happened during the World War, the Second World War, to continue to back Israel relentlessly, you know, to go outside that? Then the second question is, Germany is one of those countries that made use of universal jurisdiction. Germany, France, these are very good. Now, you touched on that in your presentation. I'm also curious as to how, you know, it will be for Germany concerning some of these violations. You know, haven't championed universal jurisdiction, haven't, you know, prosecuted persons who have been held to have committed international crimes. Now, this is touching on what they, you know, are speaking against. So I'm curious to how you think, I know you may not have the answers, but how you think, you know, German authorities would, you know, view these cases. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. I will answer the second question first. I think this will not happen. Germany will not prosecute on basis of universal jurisdiction against Israeli state officials. This will not be happening. I think maybe South Africa will be a good state for this to happen. But for Germany, it's off the table. It's not realistic. Or maybe, I don't know, I never say never, but they will not start prosecutions against Israel, because it's just against the raison d'etat. And your first question was about the German guilt. It's very big, and it's so big that we try to compensate it by blindly helping Israel no matter what. Like all the explanations that the Israeli government is feeding the media, or even the people, the German government just buys it, reproduces it, accepts it, and is not critically evaluating it. So if Israel says regarding now the ICC prosecution, or maybe the prosecution will be executed, or we don't know yet. I don't know when the decision is expected. I don't know if you are maybe more familiar with this case, what's happening at the ICC, but the German government said it's not rightful that the ICC is prosecuting or wants to prosecute, because Israel has a functioning judicial system and they can do the proceedings themselves. That's basically what they say. It's the principle of complementarity. Yes, that's basically the argument.
Okay, there is one question, actually two questions online. The first question is, so the first question, the person wants to know to what extent international intervention is not allowed or stopped for a guilty party. And then the second question concerns state sovereignty. Will the world be ready one day to see enforcement of international law, international statute or treaty?
Wow, that's a hard question. I mean, I think it's pointing to the humanitarian intervention, or what kind of intervention?
It's just in general, so.
Like that law enforcement should take place with the military intervention against Israel. I'm just trying to understand the question correctly.
I think
Ma'am, may I talk?
Yes.
Okay, yes, please, you can go ahead.
Ma'am, I'd just like to know with regards to the fact that if you have all this intervention and you got all this politics fighting in the background, to which extent can the people say we don't want intervention and we don't need anybody involved in the civil war? Or can the parties also like proclaim, say it's unfair that just say Israel's been supported by so many countries, but Palestine is being supported? Can they call for the ICJ to stop all intervention for Israel to make the war equal, or is it just going to continue until someone eventually supports Palestine?
Well, it's a hard question, and maybe you have ideas to the question, but I think it would need the action by the Security Council to make a military intervention legal under international law, and there would be no other state who could, at least military, come in and defend the Palestinian people. I mean, it is, there are several supporters for the Palestinians, but also for Israel. For Israel, the most important one is the US. And as long as they have the support by the US, I think the war will continue, or even spreading, as we see in Lebanon right now. And if we see Iran getting involved, I mean, we already see these developments of third countries being more involved in this conflict, but so far, even Iran is still working with proxies like Hezbollah or Houthi. They are not with their own soldiers coming in. So it looks like everyone wants to stay out, but still support and defend the Palestinians. But for another third country to officially get in, I don't think this will happen. And for a military intervention, we would need a Security Council resolution, which is not really realistic as long as it's backed by the US.
I think, thank you, and you're right. It will be difficult for any state to take a stand of going into the conflict as a state, but what makes it more complicated is because the situation is not really a situation of civil war. If it were, different rules would apply, because it's a situation of occupation, right? So, which means the law of belligerent occupation would apply, right? So if, as several UN General Assembly Security Council resolutions have pointed out, that this is an illegal occupation, so the occupying power is responsible, because the people whose territory it is occupying are in no position to see what happens there. The moment you occupy a territory as an occupying power, then you're responsible for what is so law enforcement and everything. So to that extent, if any country is intervening on the side of the Palestinian Authority, for example, if the state says, no, I recognize Palestine as a state, right, which is a political decision to be made by any state that is legally speaking, then what that means is such a state would be in a position, legally speaking, to enter that conflict on the side of the Palestinian state, to the extent that another state, like the United States or Germany or the UK, is siding with one of the parties to the conflict, which is the Israeli state. So if the situation, let's say this state recognizes Palestine as a state and recognizes Israel as a state, then it becomes a conflict between both states. And once another state enters the conflict on the side of one other party, it triggers the right of another state to enter the conflict on the side of the other belligerent state. So to that extent, I think it's the reality of power versus law, which we grapple with in international law to see which country is willing to risk its resources for an all-out war that has the US and Israel and possibly some European countries on the one side and these other countries on the other side with the Palestinian state. Is there a prospect for such scenario? I don't think so. At least the history suggests otherwise, that it's very unlikely and countries don't have that appetite. If it were, we would have seen a shift, especially regionally. You see, since the conflict, since October 7th, the way the Middle East response countries have responded to October 7th and Israeli action since then is very different from how it has been, at least historically. So maybe this time they want to be more cautious and explore more diplomatic options of resolving the conflict. So that is my take.
Yeah.
It's international law. There's no answer to this.
No. No.
I don't know if you.
But yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think well, mine really is sort of a response to the question that you asked. Thank you for this presentation. My name is Dan. When you ask how we in South Africa Germany, you know, or the stance that Germany takes in international law, and really, in my response, I would have to find out from you if particularly German intellectuals in German universities, if there is a grammar linguistically and culturally amongst the Germans to decisively and substantively reprimand and ridicule racism. And why do I ask this? Ukraine is invaded by Russia. Germany is appalled, is outraged. Since 1948, the illegitimate state of Israel occupies, rapes, maims, dispossesses, zombifies, thingifies Palestinian people. And the stance in Germany is abstentions, spinelessness, prevarication, and all of that. And from those of us, particularly those of us who are Black, who've been colonized for 400 years, we look at Germany and we ask ourselves, don't you have a sense of self-contradiction? Don't you have the language, the grammar to rebuke racism? Because after 1948, before 1948, it appears to us, well, not of us, not all of us in South Africa, maybe others don't think this, but those of us who have been colonized and have been subjected to the most present type of racist violence, we look at this as a failure from Germans to produce a grammar to ridicule and reprimand their own racism. So I don't know if such a language exists in German, or maybe it doesn't because you're afraid you'll get fired and all of those things. But I just wanted to know if such a language, such a grammar is available.
Thank you so much for this question. I agree with almost everything you said. And I do think there is grammar, it exists like this. I think it would not be called racism. Maybe we also have to discuss about the term racism, what that actually entails. With this case, it's called being anti-Semitic. If you're not in support with Israel, then you're anti-Semite. Is that pronounced correctly? Yes. So the language is different, but absolutely. I mean, well, with Ukraine, I think also geopolitics play a huge role. As I said before, Germany has always been completely dependent to Russia. But ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, they took a very strong stance besides money and economy and all that, and was in strong support of Ukraine. But I think this is mostly because of the American influence, because the Americans have a very strong influence on German foreign politics. And it is framed as a state of German national security to support the state of Ukraine. And with Palestine and Israel, it's our historic responsibility and duty to protect the Jewish people. So I don't see so much a language of racism in this conflict, but maybe we have a blind side on this. Maybe it's very subconscious. Maybe.
If you see, thank you for that response. If you see two things. The first, I've been working with some colleagues, German colleagues, who are looking at Germany's history and how that plays out in modern German society in terms of its foreign policy, how it responds to Ukraine, how it responds to Palestine and Israel, right? And then, importantly, how I'm speaking to his question, how it shapes Germany's response to its own colonial history, especially in Africa. You understand? So I've learned from those colleagues that for a long time, Germany didn't want to deal with that history, but gradually it's beginning to open up. The society is discussing, we have to confront and deal with these issues. So it may not have been something of racism to classify the suffering of certain people as something that should be forgotten. Here I'm referring to Namibia, or the history or the suffering of some people is more worthy of remembrance and other sorts. So how does Germany deal with that apparent contradiction? And we see the same thing in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The invasion was illegal by all means of standard, international law. It's legal. And the same international law, UN General Assembly resolutions, Security Council resolutions, and all of this since 1948 that exist and say, no, this occupation is legal. And Germany taking another directly opposite position, right? And the third thing you go to, which is why I completely agree with you, where some even German colleagues who have put it in black and white, that the kind of opposition they have faced within Germany when they started writing about Germany's colonial history and the need to confront that history and admit is what Germany did wrong, and then have the courage to admit that what it did was wrong and walk towards making reparations or whatever, and sort of push back that they faced. It's the same thing we see when we look at the literature on Ukraine, Germany's response to Ukraine, who is writing what, whose voices is being mainstream and amplified, and whose voices are being silenced. So it does, we're looking at it from Africa and the history of this continent, we're looking what is really going on in Germany.
Yeah, I think Germany is losing lots of credibility right now on the international stage because it has double standards. Definitely, it's obvious, and I don't want to defend this. I think with the case of Namibia, the process was very long and slow, but now it at least has admitted that it was the first genocide in history that was committed by Germany, and it has paid reparations. The reparation was not high, and when they were discussing the reparation, then also the victims were not part of the settlements. But still, I mean, it's a start. It's not good, it's far from perfect, but it's start, and maybe it will, the progress has just, was just started, and maybe it will get better. With Ukraine and Russia, I absolutely agree. And even, when there was war in Syria, they were against the refugees coming, or in Afghanistan, they were completely trying to close the borders. And now when this war happened in Ukraine, they opened up the borders, and Ukrainian refugees didn't even have to go through the regular procedure for getting refuge, but they were just being admitted and getting paid more than all the other refugees. Yes.
Yeah, I think for me, the reason why I asked this is because, and it's in response to the question that you asked us, how we view this. For some of us, at least, most of us, Germany has never had any credibility.
Never.
Never.
Yeah, okay.
The Holocaust happens. By the time the Holocaust happens, already as Africans were under severe colonial onslaught and violence, and maybe that you are raising the issue of refugees from UK, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Iraq, because in decolonial scholarship, which in itself has critiques, but we find scholars like Ramon Gross-Hugel and Walter Miolo who tell us about the Atlantic imaginary and colonial difference, that at the point of colonial contact, white people looked at the rest of us and said, you are not humans. So white people reserved to themselves what they thought was humanity. And that was the start of colonialism, you know. So we see it with Germany reenacting itself. The outrage about Ukraine is because the people who were dying there, the women and children who were dying there, are white people.
But
And the people who die in Palestine, the Namibia genocide, the Afghans, the Iraqis are not white people. So it's more palatable to the German society, you know. So that is why I'm asking that perhaps there needs to be a grammar that centers race. Because in the global colonial matrix of power, you still have at the top white people. And we don't, what we then need to do is to decolonize, you know. And what does that mean? To accept that all of us are humans. And until Germany grapples with that, they won't get any credibility. You know, we hear sometimes things, Prof, you might have heard this in international law, when people say Hitler was the most evil man in the world. By the time the Holocaust happens, there were countless genocides.
King Leopold has more than 20 million Congolese here.
King Leopold is more than, you know, but that is not said. Why? Because of white anti-black racism.
that was not considered a genocide.
No.
No.
His statue was standing in Brussels until recently. It was only recently.
Here we have in our own country, South Africa, settler colony, of statues and street names of people who massacred black people. And those things are acceptable. Why? Because they are white. So that black consciousness and decolonial language is what I think Germans need.
Yes, but this leads us to a very new interesting question, the question of race. Like, what is race? Is it really about color, about skin color? Because what the Nazis did about the Jewish people, they said you are not human beings because you're Jewish. But they were not black, they were all white, they looked the same.
They had been doing that to black people for 300 years.
You mean before the Holocaust?
Before the Holocaust.
Yes.
They've been doing that. And that is only when the world set up and said, what is this? Because that which they've been doing to Africans for 300 years, they started doing to white people.
But
and for me, we're not going to go anywhere if we don't sharpen contradictions as they relate to race.
So is race, I say, limited to color? Because I'm researching whether or not there is the crime of apartheid being committed in Palestine and Israel. And what people say is, no, it's not apartheid because we are not dealing with, like, it's not about the color of the skin, but it's just about the Palestinian nationality, or not nationality, but being Palestinian, the Palestinian origin.
No, it's a multiplicity of issues, in my view. It's a multiplicity of issues. There's intersectional question. But all I'm saying is that we must not do the mistake that is being done in South Africa. When we say, race doesn't matter, we're one nation, and all of that flippant, fabricated nonsense. Because race is at the center of our globe for the last 400 years, whatever you define it as. And it is anti-black racism that is at the center of what is happening in the world. Where, like I said, Miyolo and Kosciuszko in decoloniality say it very well. They say white people at the center, and they said the rest of you are not humans. You know, so if we're going to find any solutions, we must not neglect the question of the race. Nationality, yes. Ethnicity, yes. Region, yes. But race, don't neglect it. Otherwise, if we neglect it, our scholarship is dishonest. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing this. It does open up for me a new perspective, because I don't have conversation like this back home. we don't, not like this, not as honest. And so how can I learn if people don't sit on the table like this in scholarship? And how do students learn? Like, we are educating the next generation and it's just replicated, the blind spots.
Yes, and that is where transitional justice is actually moving towards, because for so long, transitional justice has focused on the traditional approaches of restorative justice, retributive justice, and all that. But now let's bring in education, right? And some societies are beginning to look at the role of education in achieving the objective of guaranteeing non-recurrence of this, because they found that some the literature shows that many, not only in Germany, Britain and some other European societies have consumed what is something like a whitewashed history
Yes.
of their own society,
their
their
own
countries,
history,
and that shapes how they respond to maybe some. And this conversation we had in the context of migration, you know, and the issue was of foreigners, especially Africans in the United Kingdom. Right? It was Britain in the United Kingdom, and you go back to where you came from. And the response, I think, was an immigrant from West Africa or somewhere. And his response was just, how would I have found my way here if your ancestors did not come to Ghana? You understand?
Yeah.
So
yes, I understand.
So it shows that this generation of British education, as it were, is only presenting a certain glorified part of their history, which is not only incomplete, but it's misleading and creating the platform for future catastrophe. If you want to create a new generation of British citizens who know who are open to other cultures and respect other people's cultures and values and whatever, then it begins with knowing as much as possible the accurate their own history as accurately as possible, and not the glorified messianic sense of colonization. You know, and I think that is where I think Germany has done far perhaps better than other European society in terms of, you know, we did wrong, now how do we right these wrongs, and we need to return those things that we stole from those people and those cultures, and then let's build a new bridge towards a better future. So in my view, and speaking to his international law, the role of international law in all of this has to perhaps we have to begin to reimagine this international law and what its purpose was. Is this fit for purpose today? If not, how do we reimagine the future and the role of international law, where everyone, I mean, not a European international law now, but the international law of humanity. Where
that's a nice term. I was going to ask you if you think that international law is equipped to grasp with this issue, or if it's on a different level. Like, is it more a topic for society and politics and not so much for law?
As presently constituted, international law is not equipped to solve that problem. And the reasons are numerous. We can go into all of that today. The reasons are numerous. The number one reason being that...
You said international law of humanity, right? I like this term.
Yes, I said international law of humanity, and not the international law of Europeans that has a different conception of what international law for other cultures or other peoples should be. So that international law of humanity for the future should be such that acknowledges that the common humanity of all peoples. So if it does that, we can reimagine and say, no, We all human beings, we all have rights, and these are the new set of standards that will regulate our intercourse as a people. The second aspect of that is which is why I think the present system is not equipped to solve the problem, is because we tend to treat this international law as a system of rules, right? That is neutral.
Yeah.
It is value neutral, and it is
Not racist.
yeah, it is supposed to be objective. You understand? But in reality, that is not true. As far as I can see, it is not correct, right? We will not address these issues without dealing with the question of capital.
Oh, yes.
We can, that is perhaps the most complex. When you explain Germany and these occasional dilemmas that policymakers have to grapple with, then what flashed in my mind was capital. When Germany when Germany deliberately makes decisions that and shoots itself in the foot, then you wonder this thing rationally doesn't make sense. How can a country, why does a country make this kind of decision? Or a country like South Africa, other African countries and Asian countries, and international law is supposed to regulate our intercourse. But we neglect the dominant role and influence of capital in shaping how international law functions and how rules are interpreted, how rules are enforced, or against whom those rules are even enforced in the first place. All of the conflicts we talk about today, whether it's in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, anywhere, you find the occupied finger of capital in it. Sometimes it is what triggers those conflicts. It is what sustains them. You see, I was reading a material last night when I saw the supposed MONUSC, that is United Nations missions in the DRC, they were shipping gold, all right? Shipping gold in exchange for weapons. And tomorrow we all wake up and say, no, there is a crime against humanity in Eastern DRC or Kivu region. So you find the finger of capital in all of this.
But are we talking about private actors and who are responsible, or is it on a state level?
That is how international law has wired all of us to think that the state is different from capital. No, in most cases, the state and capital are in bed together.
But when you say capital, I think of private actors, not so much about.
Absolutely. That is our default setting as legal academics, especially international law scholars, that when we talk about capital, the first thing that comes to our mind is that, oh, private actors.
Yes.
And my point of departure is that no, the so-called private capital and the public actors, government officials, that they are in bed together, right? And what that means is that whether it's in Washington, it's in Berlin or in London, you need to do a sort of thorough scrutiny, and you will see the sometimes very insidious relationship between capital and government officials. Whether it's how they are in board of directors of multinational corporations, how it's just so, at some point it's frustrating to see how policies that will eventually become law in a country are sometimes decided in board meetings of private corporations. You understand what I mean?
Yes, I understand. Yeah, but yeah.
You know the example that I gave, Prof, just to aid, to speak to what Prof is saying. Check the kingdom of Saudi, for example, the Saudi kingdom, as the seat of Mecca and Medina, and as the home of Wahhabism, Wahhabism being the purest form of Islam. That family, which is at the helm of the Saudi state, is the biggest friends with Israel.
Mhm.
Before the 6-day war, before everything else, all of those people who said we want to kick Israelis from Arab land because this is occupied holy land that is Arab land. Now, Saudi has changed that stance, Prof. Has changed completely, are the biggest friends of Israel. Why? Because of capital.
Mm. What are they trading? Is it also weapons or
Oil.
is it oil? Mm.
Now, the capitalist private actors who are responsible for extracting the oil there enrich the royal family. Therefore, the capitalist interests of the oil people there are what determine the policy of the state.
Mm.
So you now no longer have separation between church and state.
But is that good or bad in this case?
It's horrible. Capital is horrible.
No, but in this case, because I mean, because it was the same problem with that Germany and Russia had, because if you have trade cooperation, then they assumed you keep peace and good relations.
Yes.
So it
It's a wrong
enforces,
assumption.
but if capital is the basis of cooperation and you create this dependence between these states, then is this a prospect for peace?
No. No, when capital controls states, it's inherently.
But the control is interchange, like they both control each other. I mean,
Not
if you
quite.
have this dependency,
Not quite. The
No.
state, I mean, capital inherently also is undemocratic.
yes, that
Because the
definitely,
state
yes.
must
yes.
govern on behalf of the
Mm.
people. The state must be a democratic institution, and capital is not.
Mm.
We know it here in South Africa. Capital in South Africa is 3 or 4 white families.
Mhm.
And if those 3 or 4 white families control the South African state, you have a crisis where the majority of the country can vote a particular direction. And then the capital actors who are white
Yes.
take the states to another direction. So that's what is happening also in international law, where private state actors bend the will of the state to a certain direction. And that direction is hardly in line with what the people want.
Mm.
The people of Saudi Arabia are for peace. I mean, you made an example about the people in Germany, the minority of the people in Germany. The ordinary people on the streets in Germany are appalled by that occupation in Israel,
Yes.
in Palestine,
Yes.
But because of, as Prof is saying, of private capital actors, most of whom are white, they sway the direction that the state goes. And we who are lawyers, like you're saying, Prof, we make that mistake of thinking that capital is private actors. Capital in the post-1948 era has been at the helm of the state, running the state. Same thing with the United States of America. It's a one-party state with a grandiosity of 2 parties. And that in itself is capital power. And our problem in South Africa, of course, that this capitalists are 3 or 4 white families.
So interesting.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry to cut you. I just don't want to have our online audience feel excluded.
Yeah.
So I just want to read out a few comments. So the first comment is actually emphasizing that it's a bit odd and quite difficult when, in most times or in most instances, it happens that a state or its army is the one that is responsible for the perpetration of human rights abuses, and then having to ask the same state to almost like prosecute itself or prosecute its emissaries. So perhaps you can just comment on that perspective if you can. But most of the comments are actually coming through to appreciate the context and also the presentation that you have given and just how the conversation is opening up to issues of race, and just to say that perhaps a different perspective or a different conversation should be directed more towards the realities of what societies are facing. So it's more of our audience enjoying the honest conversations that we seem to be having.
Thank you. Well, for all the students, first of all, I want to thank you for participation, but also I want to recommend a new book that has been published by William Shabazz. It's about the colored line of international law. You're probably familiar with it. I haven't read it yet, just the parts on apartheid. It's a really good, interesting book, grasping with the issues about power imbalance and, well, yeah, like the title says, the racial lines of international law. So if your students are more interested, they can read it. They have access to it in the library.
I just saw the publication alert.
It's quite new, right?
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
yeah, you can look that up.
Yes, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I don't know, of course, you'll be following the United Nations Summit of the Future. I mean, Summit on the United Nations of the Future, right?
A little bit, yes. Yes.
So where we don't know where all of this is going to, but perhaps a little more fundamental reforms and important development. But the US has proposed 2 seats for Africa in the UN Security Council. And there have been, I mean, recently, there have been different takes on those developments or proposals. Some see it as genuine, some see it as what's your take? What do you think Germany should be Germany's response to Africa's call for reform?
But they just agree to it. They should.
Well, they said Security Council membership without the veto, right? And that's the United States proposal. Some said it doesn't make sense that 1.4 billion people will be on the Security Council without a veto.
Without a veto, right. Well, I'm not so much familiar in the process of changing the Security Council, like the rights of the Security Council. So I know that Germany has made some options, like they have tried to renew it a little bit, but I'm not so much familiar with the process, so I cannot comment on it so much.
I have a question for you, Prof.
Sure.
I asked my students that question 2 weeks ago when I heard about the process, and I asked them just to break the ice in class. I said, which 2 countries in Africa should take those Security Council seats, and what factors should contribute to which of the 2 countries, or which factors will and which factors should contribute to which of the 2 countries should be.
Thank you very much. You know, when some people who were trying to analyze the question, they said, no, don't take the United States serious. He's trying to sow discord. It's trying to sow discord. You can go and fight between yourselves about who will represent the continent on the US Security Council. Well, if you ask me, and I guess perhaps the US had that in mind when it said 2 seats. Initially, they've been talking about 1 seat until maybe, was it before 2005, they were talking about 1 seat. Then Africans started juggling among who will this wants it go to Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, or Ethiopia, or Algeria. I mean, the so-called four, whatever they call them. But now they've decided to increase it to two. Perhaps with the idea that the obvious choice would be Nigeria and South Africa. But if you ask me sincerely, I don't think whoever takes the seat, if it ever happens, whether it will make any difference. Yes, whether it's South Africa, Nigeria, whether it's Egypt or Ethiopia or Algeria or Kenya, you understand, whether it will make any difference. I don't think it will make any difference. Without even with the veto, and I tell you why.
I have to ask you, a veto just for the new countries that are coming in, no veto, or just for all the countries? What was the proposal?
The proposal without a veto for the two countries that are coming from
Oh, I
Africa.
thought you meant for all the
No, 11
countries.
members.
No, okay, sorry, I didn't understand it correctly then. I thought for all the states, they don't have a veto, right?
No. Now they want the 15 members will not have the veto except the P5. The P5 will have the veto. But if two members join, then the 5 African states will have they will have no veto.
Okay.
So that's what they're proposing. I'm thinking that for whoever takes the seat will not make any difference to Africa's condition. Even if you make they expand the council membership, and it don't make a difference. Why? Because Africa's condition is a material condition.
Yeah.
Yes, and that until that material condition changes, Africa's lot will not improve. And the example that we have is one of economic advancement, economic development. You first have to be able to feed yourself before you can even think of projecting power. And the UN Security Council and global governance is all about projecting power. That if you look at the trajectory, people don't start going, I mean, countries don't actually start going to war. The first that they are able to feed themselves, then they begin to invest in military. Then you understand, because they want to now project power. So Africa is not yet able to feed itself. So it must take care of those basics first. Otherwise, it's just going to sit on the council with veto and waste everybody's time. So I think we should do. We should pay attention to that. Brings me to what I was trying to say about capital. International law, the role, how capital influences international. You look at the rules that international law makes, whether it's in international development law, international economic, or the treaties that states enter into, or agreements, bilateral investment agreement and whatever. So agreement that states enter into between states and multinational corporations. I'm originally from Nigeria. Did you know my country has been trying to adopt what they call international oil companies, IOC, international oil company bill. And you correct me if I'm wrong. For many, many years, administration after administration, it never saw the light of day. And I think some 5 or 7 years ago, they were really pushing hard to pass the bill, which was supposed to, at least in theory, benefit local indigenous companies, that is, companies owned by Nigerians, and get them to participate in the oil producing activities, at least get some benefit from the resources in their land. One oil company, international oil company official, told boasted in private that the legislation will never see the light of day. That means it will never be adopted by the parliament.
Mm.
And that the air company has its persons in the legislature. I don't know. You know, I was trying to point out the state and capital
And
being in bed together.
private and
you
state,
know,
yes,
being
yes,
in bed together
yes,
with this thing. And that was just an example of how corrupt state
Corrupting,
officials
yes.
undermine the people.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, the way it was sold to me or to me as a student was when countries are in good trade, then it's a guarantee for peace. Because you create this interdependency. And if countries have good trade exchange, then they will not attack each other. So this was post World War II politics.
Yes.
With Russia.
Yeah. Yes.
So that's why I was asking like this. Isn't it like, is it good or bad if capital is also ruling or like in the middle of creating these rules?
The problem also.
Sorry.
Yeah, we have a question,
Yes,
right?
there's just one hand.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, okay. That's a comment.
We are waiting for the
Okay.
online people. They want to respond.
I was talking about
No.
No, we have to listen to him. He's my colleague, old colleague. Yeah,
Gabriel, you can go ahead.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for letting me for organizing this event and for allowing questions from people from all over the world. I am calling in right now from Groningen in the Netherlands. Lisa, a great presentation. I have a question where the combination of law and politics comes into play. So your presentation is about third-party obligations regarding the situation in Palestine and the Gazans in particular. Saudi Arabia has been working behind the scenes to create an accord with Israel that would recognize the state of Israel. First, do you see such an accord as being compliant with international law obligations? And second, let's say the accord does occur, let's say that the two countries do come to an agreement of recognition, where therefore Saudi Arabia will almost certainly just neglect the Palestinian issue. Do you see any form of possible, like, how would one move forward in that type of situation when two of the three large players in the region are okay with kind of dismissing the Palestinian issue? Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel, for your question. Can you give context to the time? When was this record negotiated or filed?
So it's still secret. From my limited understanding, the process began under Donald Trump as president, and a number of Middle Eastern states did sign agreements with Israel. So it hasn't been the accord hasn't been signed yet, hasn't been made public, but it's rumored to be close to being done.
And why should this violate against international law?
That was my question for you. Would it?
I don't think so. I don't know why it should, because I mean we discussed this before, the acknowledgement or the recognition of a state is completely up to the government itself. So if several governments like Saudi Arabia want to recognize Israel, did you say Israel as a state? They want to recognize Israel?
It's a key part of it. Yeah, the accord is more than that, although I'm not an expert on it. I can't spell out the details.
So yeah, I don't see where this would violate international law, because it seems like it would enhance the peace process.
And that goes to my second question. If Saudi Arabia and Israel do sign such an agreement, we have two of the three large powers in the region that are basically aligned and dismissive of the Palestinian concerns. How would what would be kind of the way to get progress in that type of situation?
Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you for joining us. My thinking is that first it will depend on whether the the agreement and simply stops at formal recognition of the state of Israel. The second thing is how that recognition is framed. I say that because of the question you asked, whether the implications of that for the state for Palestine. The issue of border for a state, a defined border is a criteria. So if the recognition of Israel is such that it contravenes existing United Nations General Assembly resolutions in relation to the pre-1967 border, then I think such recognition would patently be illegal because the pre-1967 border is I think is an important threshold for any recognition. So if the territories that had been, I mean, Russia's annexation of Crimea, we say no, it is not recognized, and it might, I mean, the same rule would almost apply that every part of Palestine that has been occupied by Israel since then, that the UN General Assembly did not recognize and international law does not recognize. And then a state comes up and takes a political decision that we recognizing that state of Israel to include those territories that are illegally acquired by conquest and annexation. I think it would be illegal and violate international law.
In my mind, I just had Israel proper immediately. I did not think about
those new settlements. No, yes.
It would be complicated.
Yes, definitely.
It would be a very complicated
yes.
question because a recognition would in some way also, in some very warped way, be helpful to Palestine. Because then it would mean, of course, technically, yes, but politically, we know that this will not be the case. Because if you recognize with the understanding of the 1967 question, you would then be saying to Israel that get out of the occupied territories that you occupied in recent years. You know.
Yes.
So that is what the technical implications would be to say you occupied illegally in recent years.
Yes.
So you need to get out of those parts that but like what you said with capital, we know that this is not about Palestine. No, it's just capital interests that are running Saudi Arabia. I mean, the Abrahamic Accords with other Arab nations. It was an insult to the Palestinian people. It was an insult to holy Arab lands. But was it legal? Yes. Completely legal. Yes. So sometimes there's a discord between what is legal and what is the right thing to do.
Bro, if you ask me, thank you. Do you think there will ever be a solution to this problem? I doubt. Let me just was religious here. And so I read in a newspaper articles many years ago where a journalist was trying to, I mean, during one of the Intifada's incidents, a journalist was running a commentary on this conflict and its origin. And the journalist said the problem started when God decided to donate the land that was owned by one group to another group. I never.
What being Great Britain?
I never forgot that, saying, I mean, looking far back in the Bible, and say it began in Genesis, whatever, and God decided to donate the land that belonged to one group to another group for your possession and your generations, and, so if you look at it, I don't think there's going to be any solution as far the so-called two-state solution, right? My own proposal would have just been, okay, have one land, the entire, including Israel, including the Palestinian territories, you understand? Let it be one country, right? Let the Israelis, the Palestinians, let all of them live in that territory and decide to give it another name.
Then it's not a Jewish state anymore.
No, that is exactly what I'm saying. That's where the compromise will come in. You understand? Where it will
But
be.
that's like the aim that's on top.
Yeah.
What the
Okay. You take South Africa, for example. You understand? For time immemorial, the blacks were here. We can't deny that, right? And then the whites came, Europeans came and settled here.
But they didn't want the blacks to be removed. They wanted blacks as laborer and to work.
If you go back to the homeland, the so-called self-governing territories, the Batustan, the rationale behind the Batustan demarcation was to put the black people in one side and say, no, this is a new country now. You are self-governing territories, the Batustan land, they call them homeland. So you are now a separate country from South Africa. The rest part, which is the largest part of the original South Africa Union of South Africa as it was, would be for Europeans, arable lands, everything that was good for this territory, right? The other people were confined to Limpopo region and homelands. So that's where you will be. That's now you now have independence, as they called it. Of course, international law did not recognize it. You understand? And the response was, no, there's going to be one country that Britain gave independence to. That country will be South Africa. So how then do we work around the division? You understand? And the idea was, okay, keep these people, you must find a way to live together somehow. You understand? But in this one country, the idea of two countries, one, the other, no. So maybe
I've got a question. Is it working? Is it working?
That's a different question. But for purposes of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I'm just thinking, no, let Palestine, Israel, one land, right? All of you.
And what is it called?
They can come up with a new name. Not Jewish state or Palestinian territory. They can create a new name. Then say, no, what system of government? You have freedom of religion. You can practice your Muslim, your Islam. You can practice your Judaism. You can practice your Christianity. You can practice a sort of multicultural society. You understand, where everyone's right is guaranteed. Everyone can vote. You can elect a Jew today. You can elect a Muslim tomorrow, Palestinian tomorrow to be president, and then perhaps something like that. Because the idea of division, of saying, no, this one is Jewish homeland, and I think perhaps
there's a scholar that we all know called Mahmoud Mamdani.
Yes.
Mahmoud Mamdani, in his latest offering, Neither Settler Nor Native, speaks of the South African question as a model that the world can learn from. So almost in similar terms, that breaking those homelands down,
yes,
having one country, starting on a clean slate. So he writes this book, Neither Settler Nor Native, where he is to a large extent also debating with his earlier thinking on the same matter. Now, Adam Getachew, Abdullah Ibrahim, Sabelo Ndlovu Kajeni, and other colleagues at Codestria, I think one more, they respond to him. Codestria puts together special issue of the journal just to respond to Mamdani.
Okay.
And one of the things that they say to Mamdani is to say, your reading of South Africa is too polite, it's too nice. That compromise has led to the originally dispossessed, has led them into a far worse position. Now, what do those decolonial scholars say? Or even on well-making with Adam Getachew and others, what do they say? They say humans and non-humans cannot coexist. If you have removed my humanity from me and you have not brought it back to me, creating one state where we all live with each other will not resolve the question that you have dehumanized me. So, and they then argue, you must go check that issue, Prof. It's 2021 December. I read it during Christmas time, and it was the most interesting debate among scholars on this issue. And they say to Mamdani, apartheid and colonialism was not a victimless or a perpetratorless crime. So Mamdani in that book strongly criticized the Nuremberg trials because he says Nuremberg focused on the individuals. You did this, you were wrong, this is the name of the crime, these are the elements, you know. So Mamdani criticizes, says the South African process was more holistic, you know, looked at the political considerations, but the key consideration that they miss is the dehumanization of the colonized. There were victims, there were perpetrators. And the original crime of colonialism is dispossession, theft. So Israelis have stolen from Palestinians, and they must bring back to them what they stole. Until that happens, there will be no peace. Just as there's no peace in South Africa, there's no peace here. By the way, if you are told that we are living together or winning the rugby, well, there's no peace here. We absolutely are at odds with each other because that which was stolen has not been brought back. You know, earlier you said in Germany you wouldn't be free because you might risk getting. It's the same here. Yeah, you know. So the solution in Israel or in Palestine will not be resolved until that which is stolen is brought back.
Prof, you know, I quite share those sentiments, but you know what? What would you say to those people who think because the Germans, Russians, now Africans, in order for everybody to get along, right? If there was a different world, we could all say, no, say, okay, Africans, since we don't get along with you guys, Europeans, we are packing our things and moving to a different earth or a different world or a different planet. But now there is no different world, there is no different planet. And some people are even saying that perhaps we should think maybe the idea of the state is part of the problem.
Yes, that's very
That the whole notion of country A started here and I mean starts here and ends here. Country B starts, then we put a border here.
Yeah.
That maybe that's part of
It's a
the problem.
construct.
Yeah,
It's not
that's just
real.
a social contract that is not that. No, if we look at the basic needs of every human being is pursuit of happiness, right? You need clothing, shelter, food, and that is what every human being, black or white, European or African, that is all we need, Asians or whatever. That if we go beyond this, it's possible to say, no, do away with this thing called countries and borders. Let all of us live. I can live in Cape Town, wake up tomorrow and say, oh, I feel like going to Berlin. Let me. Nobody will tell me or ask me anything about visa. Where is your passport? That remove all these things.
Yeah.
You understand?
Yes.
And that would then actually become free as human beings.
Yeah.
So, and I think stuff for once I thought about it, like, no, so actually it means that if you actually remove these whole structures that were created over centuries, that is actually possible. You would be solving a lot of problems and a lot of conflicts all at once. Of course, it doesn't answer, it may be very superficial thinking, solve the problem. But again, I think the fact that we are so scared of thinking of life outside the nation state is what I don't like.
Yeah.
You're creating an utopia.
Yeah, we almost always think about I think about
It's Mahmoud's argument what you're making.
yes, why can't we? I mean, it was just an outcome of European history. You get what I mean? So if it was put up by human beings, they can simply also pull it down. I think borders have led to more conflict than it has solved. Yes.
And we failed as Africa. The Monrovia and the Casablanca bloc, those people, our leaders, failed to find each other. Because the question of integration of Africa should have been a question that was responded to primarily and not be postponed for later.
Why do you think they failed?
It's capital.
Excellent. The reason we can't imagine life outside the state is basically capital. Why? Because borders, territories, are separate resources at the end of the day. In other words, what exists within this landmass called South Africa belongs to the people in this territory and should be administered by the government in this territory.
There's a political party in South Africa that lost votes in these recent elections because of saying do away with these colonial borders. So it's capital, yes.
You actually had a party that was
Yes.
Yeah, that's one of their cardinal principles.
Getting rid of
Very strong
Yes.
saying that do away with colonial borders, keep the administration as it is, document people as you're documenting them for purposes of information and data and administration, but have completely free movement of goods and persons in the borders. And when you do, especially in the SADC region, when each country does its strategic planning, it must not plan within its borders, it must plan throughout Africa, and that party lost the votes. So it's not just capital, it's also, well, it is capital at the center. Then there's indoctrination, colonial
Education, if you like.
miseducation,
Yeah.
because even those who were not taught this at school, viscerally, intuitively, their senses tell them, it makes them uncomfortable, So we have a very long road to go.
You see, my brother, it's not only you. Our presenter today is from Germany. And I've been following development, not just in Germany, in Europe recently. You see, they experimented with this thing. And my prediction is that Europe might even move towards more rigid national borders.
Yes, it is actually. Germany has reintroduced border control just 2 weeks ago.
Only recently.
Yes.
And-
The border was always open, and now
Yes.
because there was an attack by refugee. It was actually two attacks, and then, yeah, with the elections coming up, the debate got heated, and then everyone wants border control now.
No.
So say to the Schengen.
Yes. So now,
Yes.
you see, it is that miseducation. Why do I call it miseducation? I mean, with Europe's history, they took many years, decades, building this common European identity and platform. You understand? And building this common European identity and platform, and then all of a sudden they see the need to reconstruct national borders, at least in its infancy now. And my thought is that the reasons that they give, whether it's in Holland and the Netherlands and or in Germany, how the crimes committed by refugees, and if you took out all the refugees, except you can prove to me by empirical data that the crime level in Germany, or let's say murders or other crime, you understand, would drop significantly because there are no foreigners in this European country, so there is very limited crime in that. Then I would believe you.
2%, or is it 0.2%? It was very, very, very low. It's not big, but the media pushes it.
In South
And then
Africa,
you get, yeah.
So
the province called
the refugees are not.
No. It's
They are not.
big.
They are not responsible for the crime.
No, but the way it is portrayed by media, it gives politicians a way out. So to move away from all the big problems we have, put it on the refugees, and that's
They
all
say it
everything.
everywhere.
Bad schools, no finance for social system, they all put it on the refugees. And
in South Africa, the former homelands, the Bantustans,
yeah,
in Limpopo province. Limpopo is a very poor province, the northern province of South Africa, very poor, But the people in Limpopo stay in Limpopo. So it's not true that if you open borders, people from the northern parts of Africa, Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe, will suddenly come to South Africa. So it's an untested idea, it's an untested, and if you do if you do in Cape Town, if you do it in Limpopo, if you do it in Congo, you do it in Zambia, you do it in Tanzania, you'll be exercising equal development. And capital is afraid of equality. That's why capital props up these borders. It's not even a matter of crime. It's not a matter of crime. It's just miseducation, colonial bigotry, low expectations, and the number that racism has done on us. We Black people in South Africa, racism has damaged us. We are damaged in our heads, and we still need close to 100 years to recover from the colonial horror, and racism, and we will succeed. Prof, I disagree with you.
I disagree. No, I agree with you.
We will succeed.
I only disagree to the extent that when you say South Africa, you understand? The reason is because in 2023, I was involved with the United Nations, working group of experts on people of African descent.
Yeah.
So we're working on, together with the University of Addis Ababa, we're working on reparations for colonial crimes. You understand? And I think the committee was led by somebody from the Caribbean, but a Black person, a Black academic from the Caribbean. And what struck me was the same, she spoke about the same trauma, you understand, that you would identify with if you were speaking from the motherland here on the African continent. You understand? And here is somebody, a descendant of centuries, right, of ancestors in the Caribbean, and she spoke about that trauma of slavery and what it means for those people living there today. So I completely agree with you with colonization and apartheid, the trauma and intergenerational trauma for Black people cannot be undone by
winning the Rugby World Cup.
yes, by hosting the Rugby World Cup or some tokenism or cosmetic intervention, right? It has to be, number one, some sort of revolution, right?
Prof, you're speaking my language.
some sort of revolution. But what does that revolution mean? That revolution has to first be, it has to be individual and at the same time collective, to regain your human dignity because of that common suffering and dehumanization that the Black people underwent as a result of colonization and apartheid. So I'm saying whether you're a Black person in Africa or in the Caribbean, in the United States, and it's so shocking if you visit the States and you interact with a Black person in the United States, after how many years of desegregation, right, in the US, that the intergenerational trauma that their ancestors suffered is still very palpable in Black communities. And what it has done to the psyche of Black people and the feeling of self-worth and human dignity has not been undone. So how do you tackle this problem and regain your regain human dignity as a Black person or as Black people in the world? And I say it's a first an individual and then collective enterprise. Individual, why? It has to first be individual. Why? Because when you gain certain insight, then you realize that you don't need to beg anyone for your self-dignity or for your humanity. You don't need to, you claim it, you assert it. That once that kind of awareness or consciousness has become pervasive in a society where I don't need to genuflect to you to affirm a position I have taken as a human being. You understand? Once that consciousness becomes pervasive amongst a Black community, then you move on to the collective level of that sort of declaration. And that is what the Asians have done. Maybe not every part of the Asian society, but to a large extent, the Asians have been able to achieve that milestone. And that is where the failure of the failure of intellectual leadership on the African continent has done a great disservice to Africa. My brother was talking about the Casablanca bloc and the Moravian bloc. Was that where we took the wrong route on the African continent? I think yes, that was where we took the wrong route, because if Africa had gotten it right then, not just with colonial borders or whatever, I think something much more fundamental, much more authentic would have come out of that, would have regained racial pride and racial dignity, that you can say you create a system that is authentically African and that works for Africa. But right now, we are in the individual level still chasing after little things.
Professorships, research grants, this and that. You know, France was
It
not
keeps us busy.
in the 1970s.
So to come mobilize.
Sorry. I am aware that we have run out of time. We have, yes, we've scheduled this webinar from 12 to 2. So I do apologize for the conversation just going a bit over, particularly for those who had scheduled specifically for 12 to 2. So I do apologize for that. I just want to take this opportunity to also thank you for your presentation. It's quite interesting how the topic, or the title that you had, just demonstrated how complex the issues are. It's not just straightforward. There are some societal underlying issues that exist, and it's quite clear that one can't ignore such societal realities. So thank you so much for that. And thank you so much also to everyone who shared their views, Prof, and also Dr. Ntando for your thoughts, Damilola as well. So thank you so much. I think it's quite interesting when I had a look at the comments that most of them were actually appreciative, like I said, of the level of depth that exists when it comes to the issues that you have raised. So I'm actually suggesting that you share your details if you can, just so that our students and the audience can also follow your work and also your research and your areas of interest, just to connect. So I think it would be great if we share. I don't know if you have any social media pages for work related.
Not yet.
And also your email as well.
I will
Yeah, I
work
think
on
that
it,
would
yes.
be great.
Yes, definitely.
But otherwise, thank you so much for your presentation. We're actually quite I'm excited to read more, so I can see there's other comments coming through, just to thank you as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Mshoriwa, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lisa and colleagues. I do second Dr. Mnyai's sentiments that the level of discussion, the level of engagement just shows how very relevant and important this conversation is. And for me personally, I've also learned a lot because I have students, many of them from the LLB, who are writing a research paper on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I would also love to share your details with them in case they've got something to ask or to engage with you on. And then once again, just thank you everyone for taking your time to be with us. Those online, those at the center, thank you very much for this very engaging discussion. I wish we could have a follow-up conversation. We will see how that goes. Thank you very much and enjoy your day further.